On a freezing December night, my daughter stood on my porch, holding my soaked 5-year-old granddaughter. He brought his mistress home, she whispered, her teeth chattering. His mother packed our bags and locked the door. I grabbed my keys, pulled them inside, and locked the deadbolt. "Get in," I said softly. They picked the wrong family. My name is Bruce. I am 71 years old, and for the last 10 years, my son-in-law thought I was a pathetic retired insurance clerk living on a fixed pension. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his entire life without him even seeing it coming, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogant monsters deserve exactly what comes to them. The wind was howling like a wounded animal when the doorbell rang at 2 in the morning. I was already awake. At my age, sleep is a luxury that comes and goes. I tightened my flannel robe and walked to the front door, wondering who could possibly be out in a blizzard that had already dumped 8 inches of snow on our quiet Ohio suburb. I pulled open the heavy oak door, and my heart stopped. Standing there, shivering violently under the porch light, was my daughter, Natalie. She was clutching my granddaughter, Lily, to her chest. Lily was wrapped in a thin, soaked blanket, her small face buried in Natalie's neck. At their feet sat 3 black plastic trash bags rapidly collecting snow. Natalie looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red, her lips blue from the cold. "He brought his mistress home, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He brought Monica right into our living room." His mother packed our bags and locked the door. She told me I had nowhere to go but my poor dad's shack. I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the winter air. I reached out, grabbed the trash bags with one hand, and pulled my daughter and granddaughter inside with the other. I slammed the door shut against the storm and threw the deadbolt. "You are safe now," I told her, my voice steady, betraying none of the rage igniting in my chest. "Get her out of those wet clothes and bring her to the fireplace. I will make some hot cocoa." I went to the kitchen, my mind racing. Trevor, the man who had charmed my daughter 6 years ago with his slick suits and rehearsed smiles. The man who always looked at me with a thinly veiled smirk, offering to pay for my coffee out of pity. I brought the steaming mugs into the living room. The fire was roaring now. Natalie sat on the rug, wrapping Lily in my thickest wool blanket. The little girl drank the cocoa with trembling hands until her eyes grew heavy and she fell asleep right there by the hearth. Once Lily was asleep, Natalie completely broke down. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Dad, I have nothing," she cried. Trevor froze our joint bank accounts this afternoon. He canceled all my credit cards. When I tried to ask him how we were going to buy groceries, his mother Beverly showed up. She literally stood in my kitchen and laughed at me. She said Trevor was finally upgrading to a woman of his own status. Then they forced me out into the snow. Natalie looked at me with such profound defeat. "He knows you cannot afford to help me fight him, Dad. He told me to come cry in your little shack because you do not have the money for a decent lawyer." I sat down beside her, wrapping my arm around her shaking shoulders. I played the part Trevor expected me to play. I let my shoulders sag. I offered a sad, helpless sigh. "We will figure it out, sweetie," I murmured, stroking her hair. "We might not have much, but we have each other. He cannot take that away." "Oh, but he wants to," she sobbed. "He thinks we are weak. He thinks you are just a retired insurance adjuster living on a meager pension." I let her cry against my chest, playing the comforting, fragile old father. What Natalie did not know, what Trevor did not know, what no one outside of a very small, highly exclusive circle of financial titans knew, was that I was not a retired insurance clerk. I was the silent founder of a ruthless commercial real estate and private equity firm. 30 years ago, I built an empire. I bought struggling companies, restructured them, and sold them for hundreds of millions. I bought commercial high-rises across the Midwest and leased them back to the corporations that used to own them, but I always hated the spotlight. When my wife passed away 10 years ago, I stepped back from the daily operations. I transferred my assets into a complex web of blind trusts and holding companies. I bought a modest, comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. I drove a 10-year-old truck. I wore flannel shirts and spent my days gardening and reading. I wanted a quiet life for my retirement. Trevor, with his leased luxury cars and his heavily financed logistics company, thought he was the king of the world. He thought he was a self-made millionaire. He loved to brag at Thanksgiving dinners about his massive corporate warehouses, casually dismissing my life's work as pushing paper for an insurance agency. He had no idea that my holding company, through a series of corporate intermediaries, owned the underlying debt for his supposedly self-made logistics company. I literally owned the walls he operated inside. I owned the ground his delivery trucks parked on. I had remained silent for years because Natalie loved him. I swallowed his condescension because my daughter was happy. But standing there watching my granddaughter shiver next to garbage bags full of her clothes, that quiet old man died. The predator woke up. The next morning, the winter sun reflected harshly off the snow outside my window. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee when Natalie's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her face draining of color. She handed the phone to me, her hands shaking. It was a text message from Trevor. It read, "Surrender full custody of Lily today and walk away with nothing. Do that, and I will not drag you through court. Fight me, and I will leave you completely destitute. You and your pathetic father will be living on the street." Before I could process the sheer audacity of the message, Natalie's phone rang. It was Beverly Trevor's mother. I motioned for Natalie to answer it and put it on speakerphone. I immediately tapped the record button on my own device. "Good morning, Natalie." Beverly's sharp, arrogant voice echoed through the small kitchen. "I hope you and the child did not freeze in your father's little shack. Listen to me carefully. Trevor is being generous. Sign the papers today. If you try to fight us, your fragile old father will probably die of a heart attack from the legal fees alone. He cannot protect you. He is a nobody. Take the deal, Natalie. Leave Lily with us and go find a job." I reached over and ended the call, saving the recording to my secure cloud server. Natalie looked at me, tears welling in her eyes again. "Dad, what are we going to do?" she whispered. An hour later, a heavy knock pounded on my front door. It was a process server. He handed Natalie a thick manila envelope. Inside were fabricated eviction notices from her own home backdated to look legal, along with emergency custody papers accusing Natalie of being an unfit, financially unstable mother. Trevor had fired the first shot. He thought he was shooting at an unarmed, frail old man. He had no idea he had just declared war on a ghost who held the deed to his entire miserable existence. I poured Natalie another cup of coffee. Her hands were still trembling from the shock of the fabricated eviction papers. I sat across from her at my worn kitchen table. I needed her to understand the game we were about to play. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that today she had to be the exact victim Trevor expected her to be. I told her to let her tears fall. I told her to look defeated, terrified, and utterly broken. Natalie looked at me with confusion. She asked why we would let them think they had won. I explained that arrogant men like Trevor have a fatal flaw. Their egos demand a stage. If they think you are a threat, they hide their weapons. But if they think you are a helpless, wounded animal, they will gladly show you the knife. I needed Trevor to feel so victorious, so utterly untouchable, that he would hang himself with his own words. Natalie took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and nodded. She trusted me. The preliminary legal mediation was scheduled for 2 p.m. at a sleek downtown law office. I drove us in my 10-year-old pickup truck. I specifically chose to wear my oldest, most faded corduroy coat. I wanted to look like a man who counted pennies to buy groceries. Natalie wore a simple gray sweater, looking exhausted and pale. We walked into the polished glass lobby, playing the parts of the desperate father and the ruined daughter perfectly. Trevor and his mother Beverly arrived 20 minutes late. Punctuality is a sign of respect, which meant their tardiness was a calculated insult. They walked through the double doors, looking like they had just stepped off a yacht. Trevor wore a tailored navy blue suit and a luxury watch that flashed under the recessed lighting. Beverly was draped in a designer cashmere coat, holding a leather handbag that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Trevor saw us sitting in the waiting area. A smug, satisfied smirk spread across his face. He walked over not to greet us, but to inspect the damage he had caused. He looked me up and down, letting his eyes linger on my frayed collar and scuffed boots. "Nice coat," Bruce Trevor said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you pick that up at a charity drive, or have you just been wearing it since the 90s? You know, if you needed a few dollars for a decent jacket, you could have asked." "Oh wait, I froze those accounts. My mistake." Beverly let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She looked at Natalie and shook her head with mock pity. "Look at you, Natalie. It is truly tragic. But you had to know a man like my son would eventually outgrow you. You were fine for when he was starting out, but now he is a CEO. He needs a woman of substance. Monica is a vice president at a marketing firm. She wears Prada. You wear whatever that is." I placed a trembling hand on Natalie's shoulder, acting exactly like an intimidated, fragile old man. I lowered my gaze to the floor. "Please, Trevor," I said, making my voice sound weak and reedy. "There is no need for insults. We are just here to figure out what happens to Lily." Trevor laughed softly. "What happens to Lily is that she stays with me and Monica. You and Natalie sign the custody surrender, and I will be generous enough not to sue you for the legal fees of this mediation." We were called into the conference room. The mediator, a stern-looking woman, sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Trevor's aggressive lawyer sat beside him, slapping a thick stack of papers down. We had no lawyer. I had intentionally come unrepresented to sell the illusion of our absolute poverty. The mediator began to explain the process, but Trevor interrupted her immediately. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms behind his head. "Let us save everyone some time," Trevor announced. "My wife abandoned her marital home. I am the sole provider. I own a highly successful logistics company. Natalie has zero income, zero savings, and is currently living in a dilapidated shack with her father. She is an unfit mother. I am offering her zero alimony and requesting full custody of my daughter." Natalie began to cry. It was not entirely acting. The cruelty of the man she had loved was a heavy burden to bear. I put my arm around her, letting my own shoulders slouch. "Trevor, please," I begged, letting my voice crack perfectly. "She is a good mother. You know she is. I can help support them. I have my pension. I can take extra shifts at the hardware store if I need to. Just give us a little time. Just give her a chance to find an apartment." Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me as if I were a bug he was about to crush under his expensive shoe. "Time is money," Bruce Trevor sneered, "and you do not have either. You are a retired insurance clerk playing out his final years in a cheap neighborhood. You cannot afford to fight me. If you do not sign these papers today, I will drag this out in court for years. I will bleed you dry until you have to mortgage that pathetic little house of yours just to buy food." I let a look of absolute panic wash over my face. I looked at the mediator, then at Trevor's lawyer. "Could we please have just 5 minutes alone with Trevor?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Just the family. No lawyers. Please. I just want to appeal to the man who married my daughter." The mediator looked at Trevor's lawyer, who shrugged. Trevor smiled clearly, reveling in my begging. He waved his hand dismissively. "Give us 5 minutes," he told the mediator and his lawyer. "Let the old man beg." The mediator and the lawyer stepped out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind them. Beverly stayed, refusing to leave her son's side. The moment the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room shifted, though Trevor was entirely oblivious to it. I reached into my coat pocket, pretending to search for a tissue for Natalie. Instead, I pressed the tactile record button on a high-grade digital audio device I had purchased years ago for corporate espionage. "Trevor," I said, keeping my voice small and desperate. "Why are you doing this so fast? You threw her out in a blizzard. You locked the doors. If you wanted a divorce, you could have just asked for one. Why bring Monica into the house while Natalie's things were still in the closet? Why lock her out? Trevor laughed, a cold, empty sound. Because I can, Bruce. Because I wanted her out, and I did not want to deal with a long, drawn-out separation, living under the same roof. Monica's lease was up, and she wanted a house. I gave her mine. Beverly leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with malice. Trevor planned this perfectly, she bragged, completely unaware that she was confessing to premeditated emotional abuse and illegal eviction. He has been moving money around for 6 months to make sure Natalie gets absolutely nothing. We planned the lockout for the one night we knew a storm was coming, so she would be too desperate and freezing to argue. We packed her trash bags while she was picking Lily up from school. You planned this for months, I asked, forcing a tone of disbelief, while internally celebrating their utter stupidity. Of course I did, Trevor said arrogantly. Do you think I became a millionaire by leaving things to chance? I starved her out. I canceled the cards, froze the accounts, and changed the locks. By the time she realized what was happening, I already had Monica moving her boxes into the master bedroom. It was a flawless execution. Natalie is weak, and you are just a poor, useless old man. You have absolutely no leverage. I looked at Natalie. She was staring at her hands, but I could see the subtle tightening of her jaw. She was absorbing every word, fueling her own resolve. So you admit it, I said softly. You purposefully inflicted emotional distress, illegally evicted your wife without notice, and restricted her access to marital funds to coerce a custody surrender. Trevor rolled his eyes, thoroughly annoyed by my presence. You can use whatever big words you want, Bruce. It does not matter. Who is going to stop me? You. You are going to fight my corporate lawyers with your Social Security checks. Sign the papers, or I promise you I will make sure Natalie never sees her daughter again. I let out a long, slow sigh. I picked up the pen sitting next to the custody documents. Trevor leaned back, a victorious grin plastered across his face. Beverly clapped her hands together in silent delight. I held the pen over the signature line. Then very slowly, I set the pen down on the table. I looked up. The frightened, fragile old man was gone. I let the mask drop completely. I straightened my posture, letting the full weight of my actual authority fill the room. I looked Trevor directly in the eyes. I do not think we will be signing anything today, Trevor, I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was deep, resonant, and entirely calm. Trevor frowned, his grin faltering just a fraction. Excuse me. Did you not just hear what I said? I heard every single word, I replied. I heard that you premeditated an illegal lockout. I heard you admit to hiding marital assets. And I heard you confess to financial coercion regarding child custody. It was a very compelling speech. I am sure the family court judge will find it absolutely fascinating when my attorneys play the recording. Trevor scoffed, though a sudden flash of uncertainty crossed his eyes. What recording? What attorneys? You are bluffing, old man. I stood up slowly, buttoning my faded corduroy coat. I looked at Beverly, then back to Trevor. I am going to ask the mediator to come back in. We are going to officially reject your settlement offer. You will be hearing from our legal representation by the end of the week. Trevor slammed his fist on the table, standing up to try and tower over me. You are making a massive mistake, Bruce. I will destroy you. I smiled. It was a cold, practiced smile that had unsettled boardrooms across the country. You can certainly try, Trevor, but let me give you a piece of advice. Never assume you are the smartest person in the room just because you wear the most expensive suit. I offered my arm to Natalie. She stood up, her tears completely gone, now replaced by a quiet, fierce strength. We walked out of the conference room together, leaving Trevor and Beverly staring after us, confused and angry. They still believed I was just a stubborn, foolish old man. They thought I was walking into a slaughter. They had no idea that they had just handed me the rope I would use to hang them. The trap was set, and the prey was comfortably standing right in the center of it. I walked Natalie to the truck, the cold winter air feeling incredibly refreshing. I reached into my pocket and touched the digital recorder. The silent accumulation of evidence was complete. Now it was time to unleash the monsters they never knew existed. The drive back to my house was quiet. The heater in my old truck blasted warm air, defrosting the ice that had gathered on the windshield, but the real thaw was happening in the passenger seat. I glanced over at Natalie. She was staring out the window at the passing snowbanks, but her posture had changed. The slump of a victim was gone. In its place was the rigid, quiet stillness of a woman who had just realized she was not trapped in a cage, but rather she was holding the key to one. She did not ask me about the recording. She did not ask me about the lawyers I had mentioned in the mediation room. She simply trusted me the way she had when she was a little girl holding my hand to cross a busy street. As soon as we pulled into the driveway and got safely inside the house, I told Natalie to go make us some tea. I walked down the narrow wooden stairs into my basement. To anyone else, it looked like a standard storage space filled with boxes of Christmas decorations and old winter coats. But behind a heavy reinforced steel door, hidden by a false shelving unit, was my home office. It was a soundproof, climate-controlled room equipped with enterprise-grade servers and encrypted communication lines. It was the nerve center of the empire I had supposedly retired from. I sat at my mahogany desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and made a single phone call. The man who answered on the second ring did not say hello. He simply breathed into the receiver, waiting. "I need a full teardown, Carter," I said into the phone. "The target is Trevor. I want every bank statement, every corporate ledger, every hidden shell company, and every single digital footprint he has left over the last 6 years. I want him financially dissected." Carter was not just a private investigator. He was a financial shark, a digital phantom, who had worked exclusively for my firm for 2 decades. When corporate rivals tried to hide assets during hostile takeovers, Carter was the man who found the buried treasure. He was a man who lived and breathed data, a genius who viewed firewalls and bank encryption not as obstacles, but as minor inconveniences. "Consider him dissected." Bruce Carter replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Give me 48 hours. He did not need 48 hours. Trevor was exactly the kind of man I had spent my entire career destroying. Arrogant, flashy, and utterly convinced of his own untouchable brilliance. Men like Trevor spend so much time polishing the hood of the car that they never bother to check if the engine is actually bolted in. They use the same passwords for their banking apps as they do for their golf club memberships. They leave digital trails a mile wide because they honestly believe no one is smart enough to look for them. Less than 24 hours later, Carter was sitting in my basement office. He had driven through the night, arriving before dawn, with a thick leather briefcase and a secure hard drive. I poured him a cup of black coffee. He did not drink it. He just opened the briefcase and began laying out printed spreadsheets and financial flowcharts across my desk, with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing his instruments. I brought Natalie down into the office. She stood in the doorway staring at the walls of monitors and the massive servers humming quietly in the corner. She looked at me, then at Carter, her eyes wide with confusion. "Dad, what is all this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is he?" "This is the man who is going to hand us Trevor on a silver platter," I told her gently. "Have a seat, sweetie. It is time you saw the real numbers behind your husband's so-called empire." Carter pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and tapped a manicured finger against the top document. "Trevor thinks he is a mastermind." Bruce Carter began, a grim smile playing on his lips, but his security architecture was a joke. I bypassed his corporate firewalls in under 12 minutes. He uses a commercial-grade accounting software for a logistics company that handles millions in freight. It is like putting a padlock on a screen door. Carter slid the first stack of papers toward Natalie. "These are the operating ledgers for his logistics firm over the last 3 years. The firm is generating revenue, yes. The trucks are moving, the contracts are real. But the profit margins he reports to his investors are entirely fabricated. He has been running 2 sets of books, one for the IRS and his major investors, and the actual raw data hidden on an unencrypted subserver. I leaned forward, inspecting the spreadsheets. The numbers told a story of staggering, almost comical greed. Trevor was not a successful CEO. He was a thief operating a glorified Ponzi scheme. He was systematically bleeding his own company dry. "Look at the vendor payouts," Carter instructed, pointing a pen at a series of recurring wire transfers. Every month, Trevor authorizes massive payments to a third-party consulting firm for what he logs as route optimization software. The only problem is that this consulting firm does not exist. It is a shell company registered in Delaware. "And who owns the shell company?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be damning. "Trevor does," Carter replied flatly. "He is embezzling investor capital. He funnels the money out of his logistics company under the guise of operating expenses, washes it through the Delaware shell, and then distributes it into 3 private offshore accounts. Over the last 2 years alone, he has siphoned almost $4 million from his own backers." Natalie gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. $4 million, she choked out. But how? Why? He always complained about cash flow at the end of the quarter. He told me we had to be careful with our spending because the business was eating up all our liquid assets. Because he was spending it on his other life, I told her, my voice turning to ice. "Show her the disbursements, Carter." Carter pulled out a secondary file containing bank statements and real estate deeds. He placed a color photograph of a stunning, ultra-modern penthouse apartment on the desk. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound balcony, and high-end designer furnishings. "This is the luxury condo located downtown," Carter explained. "It was purchased in cash 7 months ago for $1.2 million. The deed is registered under an LLC, but the sole beneficiary and current resident is Monica. Your husband did not just move his mistress into your house, Natalie. He has been funding her entire life with stolen investor money. The furniture, the imported sports car she drives, the designer clothes she wears. Every single penny traces back to the funds Trevor embezzled." Natalie stared at the photograph of the condo, her breathing shallow and rapid. She traced the edge of the paper with a trembling finger. "All those nights, he said he was working late at the warehouse," she whispered, the betrayal washing over her face in real time. "All those weekends, he said he had to travel to secure new shipping routes. He was just down the street. He was buying her $1 million home while telling me I spent too much on groceries for his daughter." "It gets worse," Carter said, entirely unsympathetic to the emotional drama. "He was a man of data, and the data was about to destroy another illusion. Trevor is not just funding the mistress. He is plugging a massive leak created by his mother." Carter slid a thick stack of casino statements and private lending contracts across the desk. "Beverly portrays herself as a woman of high society," Carter explained, his tone laced with disgust. "She attends the country club luncheons, wears the cashmere coats, and talks down to anyone who does not drive a German car. But Beverly has a sickness. She is a high-stakes gambling addict." I looked at the statements. The losses were astronomical. Beverly was dropping $50,000 a weekend at underground poker games and exclusive casino VIP rooms across state lines. She had exhausted her own savings years ago. When she ran out of her own money, she started borrowing from private, unlicensed lenders, Carter continued. "Dangerous people who do not care about your country club status when they come to collect. Trevor has been using the embezzled corporate funds to pay off his mother's gambling debts and keep her kneecaps intact. Over the last 18 months, he has wired almost $800,000 to cover her losses. That is why Beverly hates you, Natalie. You were a married expense draining resources away from her gambling bailout. The sheer audacity of their hypocrisy was almost too much to process. Beverly had stood in my kitchen and mocked my daughter for being poor. She had sneered at my faded coat and called me a nobody. Meanwhile, she was a desperate, broke addict surviving on money her son was actively stealing from his business partners. They were not high society. They were common criminals wearing expensive perfumes to hide the stench of their own rotting lives. Trevor is bleeding capital from every major artery, Carter concluded, leaning back in his chair. He is supporting a luxury mistress, a gambling-addicted mother, and trying to maintain the facade of a millionaire CEO. The corporate accounts are completely hollowed out. His upcoming quarterly audit is in 3 weeks. When his investors realize the money is gone, he will be facing federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny charges. He is a dead man walking. He just does not know that his heart has stopped beating yet. I looked at my daughter. The shock had passed, replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. She looked at the spreadsheets, the photos of the condo, the casino markers. She was no longer looking at the man she married. She was looking at a federal inmate. "They locked me out in a blizzard," she said, her voice eerily calm, possessing a familiar ruthlessness I had not heard from her in years. "They told me I was nothing. They tried to steal my child." I reached across the desk and placed my hand over hers. "Trevor thought he was being clever by freezing your personal accounts," I told her. "He thought he was cutting off your oxygen. But all he really did was hand us the exact financial roadmap we needed to destroy him." "What do we do now?" she asked, looking up at me, her eyes completely dry. "Now," I said, a slow, predatory smile forming on my face. "Now we let them think they are winning. We are going to let Trevor scramble to hide his tracks. We are going to let Beverly try to buy her way into high society one last time. And then we are going to burn their house of cards to the ground while they are still standing inside it. Carter, pack up the files. We are going hunting." The winter freeze held our small Ohio town in an iron grip the next afternoon. Natalie and I sat in my old pickup truck outside the elementary school waiting for the kindergarten dismissal bell. The engine rattled a low, steady hum while the heater struggled to keep the frost off the windows. Natalie rubbed her hands together. Her eyes were fixed on the red brick building. She was extremely anxious. Trevor had sent 3 more text messages that morning. Each one escalated in hostility. He promised that his lawyers were preparing to bury her. I had told her to ignore them completely. We needed him to exhaust himself throwing punches at shadows. But a mother's fear for her child is a powerful thing, and Natalie was wound tight. I patted her knee and told her to breathe deeply. We were just picking up Lily. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon, but predators rarely respect boundaries, and Beverly was about to prove exactly how reckless arrogance could make a person. The final bell echoed across the snow-covered playground. Heavy doors swung open, and a sea of children in puffy winter coats poured out into the cold air. Natalie stepped out of the truck and walked toward the designated pickup area. I followed a few steps behind. I kept my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my faded corduroy coat. I played the part of the slow-moving grandfather perfectly. We spotted Lily almost immediately. She was holding her teacher's hand. Her bright pink scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck. Natalie smiled and her posture relaxed for the first time all day. But before my daughter could reach out to embrace her little girl, a sleek silver luxury vehicle jumped the curb. It parked illegally right in the bus lane. The driver's side door flew open. Beverly stepped out wearing a full-length fur coat and designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She marched across the icy pavement like she owned the entire municipality. Beverly did not even look at Natalie. She walked straight toward Lily and the teacher, extending her manicured hands. "Come to Grandma, sweetie," Beverly announced loudly. She ensured every parent in the vicinity could hear her voice. "Your father sent me to pick you up today. We are going to go look at your new bedroom at the new house." Natalie froze completely. The color drained from her face. She rushed forward and stepped squarely between Beverly and the teacher. "What are you doing here?" Natalie demanded. Her voice shook with a mix of absolute panic and outrage. "Trevor has no right to send you here. It is my custody day." Beverly let out a sharp theatrical laugh that carried across the frozen schoolyard. Several parents turned their heads, and their conversations halted entirely. "Oh, please, Natalie," Beverly sneered. Her voice dripped with venom. "Trevor is the sole provider for this child. You do not even have a house anymore. You are living in a shack with an old man who cannot even afford a decent vehicle. You are completely unstable. The court is going to give us full custody anyway, so I am just saving everyone the trouble." Lily shrank back behind her teacher. Her little hands gripped the woman's coat. The teacher was a young woman looking utterly terrified. She raised her hands defensively and stated that she could only release the child to her primary guardian. Beverly ignored her completely. She took a step toward Natalie and invaded her personal space. She pointed a rigid finger at my daughter's chest. "Do not make a scene in front of these people, Natalie. You are embarrassing yourself. Step aside and let me take my granddaughter before I call the police and tell them you are having a mental breakdown." This was the moment. This was the exact moment an arrogant predator overplays their hand because they believe there are no consequences. I let my shoulders slump forward and bent my back slightly. I shuffled toward them, making my breathing sound ragged and labored. "Please, Beverly," I pleaded. I let my voice crack perfectly. I stepped in front of Natalie and placed my frail-looking body between my daughter and the monster trying to steal my granddaughter. "Please do not do this. You are scaring the child. Just go back to your car. Let us handle this through the lawyers. We do not want any trouble today." Beverly looked at me with absolute disgust. To her, I was not a man. I was a pathetic, penniless insect standing in the way of her grand victory. She actually curled her lip. "Shut up, old man," she spat. "You have no authority here. You have no money and no power and no right to tell me what to do. You are a complete joke. Go sit in your rusty truck before you break a hip." I raised my hands in a universally recognized gesture of surrender and peace. I took one tiny half step forward. I positioned myself exactly in the center of the walkway. I knew precisely where the school security cameras were mounted on the brick facade above the main doors. I made sure my back was to the camera. I gave the lens a clear and unobstructed view of Beverly's face and her actions. "Please just leave us alone," I whimpered loudly. Beverly lost whatever thin shred of patience she had left. She did not just walk around me. She raised both of her hands and placed them flat against my chest. She shoved me with all of her body weight. "Get out of my way," she screamed. Now, if I wanted to, I could have planted my feet and broken both of her wrists before she even realized what was happening. But a master strategist knows exactly when to take a hit. I allowed my feet to slide on the icy pavement. I let my body fall backward and went completely limp. I hit the ground hard. I made sure to land on my shoulder and roll, letting out a sharp, painful cry. I lay there on the cold concrete, clutching my chest. I groaned as if the breath had been completely knocked out of me. The schoolyard erupted. Several mothers screamed in shock. A father standing nearby dropped his coffee and rushed over to help me. Natalie dropped to her knees beside me. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed at Beverly to get away from us. The young teacher pulled out her radio and frantically called for the school resource officer. Beverly stood over me looking down. She showed a momentary flash of shock that quickly morphed back into arrogant rage. She realized she had just shoved an elderly man to the ground in front of 50 witnesses. But her ego refused to let her back down. "Oh, stop acting so dramatic," she scoffed, adjusting her fur coat. "I barely touched him. He just slipped on the ice. He is probably drunk." But the tide had turned entirely against her. Two burly fathers stepped between Beverly and where I lay on the ground. A uniformed school resource officer jogged out of the double doors. His hand rested cautiously on his utility belt. "Ma'am, you need to step back to your vehicle immediately," the officer commanded. His voice echoed across the courtyard. Beverly glared at the officer and then glared at Natalie. "This is not over, Natalie," she threatened loudly. "Trevor is going to crush you in court. You are nothing." She turned on her heel and marched back to her illegally parked vehicle. She slammed the door and sped off with her tires spinning on the slick pavement. Several parents helped me sit up. Natalie was shaking and asking me over and over if I was hurt. I squeezed her hand tightly. I gave her a reassuring look that completely contradicted the frail groans I was making for the audience. "I am fine, sweetie," I wheezed, letting a kind father help me to my feet. I just lost my balance, that is all. The resource officer approached with a notepad. He asked if I wanted to press charges against the woman. I shook my head slowly and acted deeply ashamed and embarrassed. No, I murmured softly. It is a family dispute. I do not want to cause a fuss for the school. I just want to take my daughter and granddaughter home. The principal was a stern but compassionate man. He had rushed out to the courtyard. He ushered us inside the warm administrative office to make sure I did not need an ambulance. Natalie sat with Lily in the reception area to calm the frightened child. I asked the principal for a private moment in his office. Once the door clicked shut, I dropped the fragile old man routine entirely. I straightened my back and looked the principal squarely in the eyes. My voice was calm, clear, and resonant with authority. Sir, I am currently navigating a highly volatile domestic situation to protect my daughter and granddaughter from an aggressive individual, I stated. That woman is unstable and dangerous. I need a copy of the exterior security camera footage from the last 20 minutes. I know school policy dictates you hand it over to law enforcement, but I am filing a restraining order this afternoon. Having that footage immediately will expedite the process and ensure she cannot step foot on school grounds again to traumatize these children. The principal looked at my sudden change in demeanor. He recognized the quiet power of a man who commanded respect. He nodded slowly and walked over to his computer terminal. He accessed the security feeds. Within 10 minutes, he handed me a digital file on a thumb drive. I slipped the drive into my pocket. Trevor and Beverly thought they were intimidating a weak victim. Instead, they had just handed me irrefutable high-definition felony assault evidence. The trap was continuing to snap shut, and they were the ones eagerly tightening the springs. We left the school and drove back to my house in complete silence. The snow had started to fall again, covering the icy roads in a fresh layer of white powder. Natalie stared straight ahead. She was processing the reality of what her mother-in-law had just done. The fear she had carried for the past 2 days was finally burning away, and in its place a quiet, cold anger was taking root. That was exactly what I needed her to feel. Fear makes you hesitate, but anger makes you focus. I carried Lily inside and settled her onto the living room sofa with a cartoon and a fresh bowl of popcorn. Once the child was distracted, I looked at Natalie and nodded toward the basement door. Carter was still down there, and I knew my financial shark well enough to know he had not stopped digging while we were out playing the victims. We walked down the wooden stairs, and the heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside my soundproof office. Carter was sitting exactly where we had left him. The desk was now cluttered with empty coffee cups and discarded energy drink cans. The glow from the 6 massive monitors illuminated his face in the dim room. He did not look up when we entered. He just kept typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a rhythmic intensity. I pulled out a chair for Natalie and stood behind her, resting my hands on the leather backing. I asked Carter what he had found. Carter stopped typing and leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his tired eyes and let out a long breath. He told me that Trevor was not just a common embezzler trying to sustain a flashy lifestyle. He told us that Trevor was actively preparing to vanish. Carter brought up a complex digital schematic on the largest monitor. He pointed to a series of red lines connecting Trevor Logistics Company to a maze of international banking institutions. For the past 72 hours, Trevor has been liquidating his physical assets, Carter explained. He is quietly selling off his delivery trucks to a third-party competitor at a massive loss just to get liquid cash fast. He is cashing out the warehouse leases and draining the payroll accounts. He is completely hollowing out the logistics firm. Natalie leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in confusion. She asked why he would destroy his own company. She pointed out that his ego was tied entirely to being a successful chief executive. Carter let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He explained that Trevor no longer cared about his local reputation because he had no intention of staying in the country. Carter tapped a few keys, and a banking dossier appeared on the screen. The liquidated capital was not going into Trevor domestic accounts. It was being funneled through a series of offshore shell corporations before finally resting in a private banking institution in the Bahamas. I inspected the banking details. The offshore account was not registered under Trevor's name. It was registered exclusively under Monica. Trevor was funneling millions of dollars into his mistress' control. He was planning to board a plane and disappear to an island where federal auditors could not easily touch him. But Carter was not finished. He turned his chair to face Natalie directly, and his expression turned incredibly grim. He told her that stealing the money and fleeing the country was only half of Trevor's master plan. The other half involved making sure Natalie took the fall for every single stolen penny. Carter opened a new folder on the desktop. It was filled with scanned copies of high-level corporate loan agreements and massive commercial credit applications. He explained that to cover the tracks of his embezzlement and to keep his mother's dangerous gambling debts at bay, Trevor had taken out severe lines of credit over the last 6 months. We were looking at millions of dollars in corporate debt. But a bank does not just hand over millions without collateral and a personal guarantor. Carter enlarged the signature page of the most recent loan document. At the bottom of the page, right on the line indicating the primary personal guarantor, was Natalie's signature. Natalie gasped and pushed herself back from the desk. She shook her head frantically. She swore to me that she had never seen those documents in her life. She told us she never signed any loan agreements for his logistics company. She had always kept her personal finances completely separate from his business dealings. I leaned in and examined the digital ink. To an untrained eye, the signature looked authentic. It perfectly mimicked the loops and curves of my daughter's handwriting. But I had spent 30 years destroying corporate fraudsters. I recognized a digital forgery when I saw one. Trevor had lifted her signature from an old tax return and digitally grafted it onto the loan applications. The sheer malice of his endgame was staggering. Trevor was not just locking his wife out in the snow to move his mistress in. He was staging a financial execution. His plan was to file for an expedited divorce while simultaneously declaring corporate bankruptcy. He would present the forged documents to the bankruptcy courts, making Natalie the sole personal guarantor of his massive fraudulent debt. While he and Monica lived like royalty on a beach in the Bahamas, Natalie would be left holding the bag. The federal government and the aggressive private lenders would come after her. They would seize her future wages, ruin her credit, and potentially press criminal fraud charges against her. Trevor intended to leave the mother of his child rotting in a federal prison just to ensure his own clean getaway. Natalie began to hyperventilate. The panic she had managed to suppress at the school came rushing back with a vengeance. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeves. She asked me how he was supposed to prove she did not sign those papers. She was terrified that the courts would take Lily away and lock her in a cell for a debt she knew nothing about. She was spiraling, and I needed to stop it immediately. I placed both of my hands firmly on her shoulders and made her look at me. I kept my voice incredibly steady and calm. I told her that she was not going to prison, and she was not paying a single cent of that debt. I explained that arrogant men like Trevor always make one fatal miscalculation when they think they are the smartest person in the room. They assume no one is watching the shadows. I looked at Carter and asked him to pull up the routing information for the private lending firm that had issued Trevor the largest block of his fraudulent loans. Carter smiled a sharp, knowing smile. He pulled up the corporate registry for the lending firm. I pointed to the screen and told Natalie to read the name of the primary holding company that financed the loan. She read the name aloud slowly. It was a generic-sounding investment trust. Then I told her to look at the registered owner of that trust. Her eyes widened as she read my name at the top of the corporate registry. The panic in her eyes slowly dissolved into profound shock. I explained to her that Trevor had been so desperate for cash to cover his embezzlement that he had bypassed traditional banks and sought capital from private equity lenders. He had blindly stumbled into my financial web. By forging her signature on those specific documents, Trevor had not just committed standard wire fraud. He had inadvertently tried to defraud my personal holding company. He had signed his own death warrant using my stolen money. I stood up and smoothed the front of my faded corduroy coat. I told Carter to monitor the offshore transfers, but not to block them just yet. We needed Trevor to fully commit. We needed him to move the very last dollar into Monica's account, so he would be completely stripped of domestic assets. Once he had nothing left to fall back on, we would slam the steel doors shut on his perfect escape. Trevor thought he had built an elaborate trap to bury my daughter. He had no idea he had just walked blindly into a minefield and I was holding the detonator. The digital traps were set, but I needed to secure my daughter's immediate financial independence before we triggered the avalanche. Trevor believed he had severed Natalie's access to her own money, leaving her paralyzed and dependent on his meager settlement offers. It was a classic abuser's tactic, starvation by financial attrition. The next morning, I drove Natalie to the local branch of her primary bank. She was still incredibly tense, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. She worried that walking into the bank would trigger an alert to Trevor, allowing him to accelerate his offshore transfers before we were ready. I assured her that the man we were about to speak with answered to a higher authority than a bloated logistics executive. We bypassed the main teller lines and walked directly toward the executive offices at the rear of the building. The branch manager, a sharp young woman in a tailored suit, stepped out to intercept us, assuming we were lost. Before she could ask if we had an appointment, I handed her a sleek black business card with a single silver emblem embossed in the center. I asked her to please inform Mr. Sterling that Bruce was waiting in the lobby. The manager looked at the card, her eyes widening slightly, and disappeared into the back office. Less than a minute later, the heavy glass door swung open. A tall, distinguished man in his late 50s stepped out, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. Arthur Sterling was the regional director of the bank's wealth management division. 30 years ago, he was a brilliant but struggling junior analyst who had accurately predicted a devastating market crash. The senior partners had laughed at him and fired him for causing panic. I had recognized his genius, hired him the very next day, and backed his strategies with my own capital. He made me millions, and I made his career. Arthur owed me a debt he openly admitted he could never fully repay. Arthur ushered us into his private oak-paneled office and offered us coffee. He did not treat me like a retired clerk in a faded coat. He treated me like the kingmaker I had once been. I explained the situation concisely, detailing Trevor's illegal freezing of Natalie's personal checking and savings accounts. Arthur's face hardened as he listened to the sheer audacity of the financial abuse. He pulled up Natalie's profile on his terminal. He confirmed that Trevor had exploited a loophole in their joint marital status to place a unilateral hold on her individual assets, claiming she was engaged in erratic, unapproved spending. Arthur did not need to ask for my permission to act. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the bank's internal fraud division. He authorized an immediate unconditional release of the freeze on Natalie's accounts, overriding the hold with his executive clearance. He assured Natalie that her funds were fully accessible and that a new secure account had been opened in her name alone, insulated from any future marital claims. But I was not finished. I told Arthur that Trevor was actively liquidating corporate assets and funneling them through offshore shell companies. I handed him the preliminary dossier Carter had compiled, highlighting the suspicious rapid-fire wire transfers to the Bahamian accounts. Arthur reviewed the data, his expression turning dangerously cold. He explained that banks are legally obligated to investigate sudden massive movements of liquid capital, especially when those funds are routed through known tax havens. Arthur initiated a high-level suspicious activity fraud review on every single account bearing Trevor's name. This was not a standard freeze. This was a total algorithmic lockdown triggered by federal anti-money laundering protocols. Every personal checking account, every corporate line of credit, every single credit card tied to Trevor's social security number was instantly paralyzed. Arthur explained that Trevor would not even be able to buy a cup of coffee until the investigation concluded, a process that typically took weeks if not months to resolve. Less than an hour later, we were back in my truck, driving toward my house. Natalie checked her banking app on her phone. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she saw her newly secured, fully funded account balances. She finally had her independence back. Just as we pulled into the driveway, Natalie's phone began to vibrate violently. It was Trevor. I told her to put it on speakerphone and hit record. Natalie, Trevor shouted, the moment the line connected, his voice high-pitched and laced with absolute panic. Did you do something to the accounts? Every single card I have is declining. My corporate portal is locked. I just tried to buy gas, and the terminal said my accounts are under federal review. What did you do? Natalie looked at me, a fierce, empowered smile spreading across her face. I did not do anything. Trevor, she replied, her voice cool and utterly calm. I have been at my dad's house all morning. Maybe the bank realized you were moving a little too much money around. You should probably call customer service. I hear their hold times are terrible today. She ended the call and blocked his number. Trevor, the self-proclaimed mastermind, was now stranded at a gas station, completely cut off from the millions he thought he controlled. The financial starvation he had tried to inflict on my daughter had just boomeranged, trapping him in a prison of his own making. Monica threw her housewarming party on a Friday evening. The penthouse condo was a magnificent glass and steel monument to Trevor and his stolen ego. I walked through the double doors of the building entirely unnoticed. Caterers in crisp white shirts carried silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The bass from the sound system thumped through the floors loudly enough to mask the hollow and fake nature of the guests. Monica stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering downtown skyline. She was dripping in diamond jewelry paid for by my daughter and her suffering. She laughed loudly while holding court among her shallow friends. I watched her for a long few minutes. I wanted to see exactly what Trevor had traded his family to obtain. It was a pathetic display of purchased affection and staggering arrogance. I did not wear my faded corduroy coat tonight. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit that I had tailored in Milan nearly 10 years ago. It is amazing how invisible you can be when you dress like you belong, while carrying the quiet stillness of an apex predator. I moved through the crowded living room and declined a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. I made my way toward the massive marble kitchen island. Monica broke away from her group to refill her crystal glass. She was smiling and radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who truly believed she had just won the ultimate prize. She thought she had stolen a corporate titan. She had no idea she had merely leashed herself to a sinking stone. I stepped up to the counter right next to her. Beautiful place, I said, keeping my voice smooth and completely casual. The view of the skyline from this altitude is quite impressive. Monica looked me up and down. She noted the cut of my suit and the confident way I held myself. She offered a rehearsed, flirtatious smile. Thank you, she purred, tossing her hair over her shoulder. My boyfriend Trevor just bought it for me. He wanted to make sure I had the absolute best. He is an incredibly successful logistics executive. I smiled back, offering a cold and practiced expression. I am sure he tells everyone that, I replied. It takes a very specific type of man to purchase a penthouse of this magnitude in cash. She leaned against the marble counter and swirled the expensive champagne in her glass. Trevor is very generous, she bragged. We are completely remodeling the master suite next month. He says I deserve a private sanctuary away from all the drama of his past. I let her gloat. I let her paint the detailed picture of her perfect, stolen future. I wanted her to climb to the very peak of her own vanity so the fall would break every single illusion she held. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a single thick sheet of heavy legal paper. I placed it gently on the pristine marble counter between us. I slid it forward until it rested right next to her champagne glass. I think you might want to hold off on picking out paint colors for the master suite, Monica, I said. My voice dropped an octave, carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. She frowned and looked down at the document. What is this? She asked. Her flirtatious tone vanished completely, replaced by annoyed confusion. This is a formal notice of immediate foreclosure and eviction, I explained calmly. It is effective as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. The building management will be changing the locks on this specific unit on Monday morning. I suggest you start packing your designer bags tonight. Monica let out a sharp, indignant laugh. She picked up the paper, and her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. "This is some kind of sick joke, right?" she scoffed. "Trevor bought this condo outright. We have the deed. We signed the papers last week." "You have a fraudulent piece of paper," I corrected her without blinking. "You see, Trevor attempted to purchase this luxury unit using funds directly from his corporate accounts. The severe problem is that Trevor does not actually possess any liquid capital. All of the massive cashier checks he used to secure this property bounced yesterday afternoon. His accounts are completely locked under a federal fraud investigation. The money does not exist." She stared at me. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her voice trembled with the first undeniable traces of genuine fear. "Are you someone from the bank?" I shook my head slowly, maintaining my relentless eye contact. "I am not from the bank, Monica. My name is Bruce. I am Natalie's father, and my private holding company owns this entire building." The crystal glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble counter and shattered instantly. Champagne spilled everywhere, pooling over the foreclosure notice, but the heavy dark ink did not run. Several guests turned to look at the sudden commotion, but I kept my gaze locked entirely on her. "Trevor told me his father-in-law was a broke insurance agent," she stammered. She stepped back as if the counter had just caught fire. "Trevor tells a tremendous amount of lies," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "He lied to my daughter. He lied to his corporate investors. And he certainly lied to you. You are currently throwing a lavish housewarming party inside an active crime scene. Every piece of custom furniture in this room, the caterers handing out caviar, the diamond necklace you are currently wearing around your neck, all of it was purchased with heavily embezzled money." Monica looked around her lavish penthouse as if the expensive walls were suddenly closing in to crush her. "But he has millions," she insisted. Pure desperation crept into the pitch of her voice. "He showed me his portfolio. He showed me the offshore accounts. He promised me we were going to travel the world. He showed you fabricated spreadsheets," I corrected her sharply. "The offshore accounts you are referring to, the ones he recently registered exclusively in your name in the Bahamas, have already been flagged by international banking authorities. Trevor tried to funnel his stolen money directly through your identity to hide his tracks. Do you understand what that means, Monica? That makes you an accessory to federal wire fraud and international money laundering." Her breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. She grabbed the edge of the wet counter to steady her shaking legs. "You are lying," she gasped, shaking her head. "He would not do that to me. He loves me." "He loves his ego," I said coldly. "He used you as a digital dumping ground for his stolen assets because he thought he could escape the country and leave my daughter to take the fall. But I froze every single one of his domestic accounts. He has absolutely nothing left. He cannot even buy a cheap plane ticket to reach whatever scraps he managed to hide under your name. You are tied to a sinking ship, Monica, and the federal auditors are already reviewing the passenger manifest." "I do not believe you," she cried, pulling her cell phone out of her clutch. She dialed his number with trembling thumbs and put the phone on speaker. She needed to prove me wrong. She needed the man who bought her this penthouse to answer and tell her it was all a terrible mistake. The phone rang twice before Trevor picked up. His voice did not sound arrogant or smooth. He sounded like a cornered, terrified animal. "Monica," he panted, his breath hitching. "Monica, I need you to wire me cash from the island account right now. My cards are entirely shut down. The bank locked the corporate portal. I cannot access anything." Monica stared at her phone in absolute horror. "Trevor, what is going on?" she cried. "There is a man here named Bruce. He says you are broke. He says you put stolen money in my name." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and utterly damning. Trevor realized exactly where I was and what I had just done. "Trevor," Monica screamed into the phone. "Did you steal that money?" I hung up, Trevor stammered. "I have to go, Monica. Do not talk to him." The line went dead. The dial tone echoed loudly over the kitchen island. Monica dropped her phone onto the marble counter. Her entire carefully constructed reality shattered into 1,000 unfixable pieces right in front of my eyes. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as the severe legal and financial implications crashed down upon her. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality of my words. You have 48 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property. If you take so much as a single light fixture that was purchased with my daughter's stolen marital funds, I will personally ensure the district attorney adds grand theft to your long list of accessory charges. I turned my back on her and walked toward the exit. The party music continued to thump loudly through the speakers, playing a ridiculous, cheerful soundtrack to the absolute destruction of her life. I did not look back. I walked out of the double doors, leaving the mistress surrounded by her shallow friends and a mountain of federal debt. The poison was fully in the water, and Trevor's entire false empire was burning straight to the ground. The weekend passed in a blur of silent and meticulous preparation. Trevor was completely isolated. His mistress had abandoned the sinking ship. His personal accounts were frozen under federal review. His wife and child were safely secured in my home. The only thing Trevor had left was the looming shadow of his upcoming corporate audit. It was scheduled to happen in exactly 3 weeks. The auditors would demand full access to his corporate ledgers. They would look for the missing millions. When they found empty vaults instead of investor capital, he would be handed over to the authorities. He was a man standing on railroad tracks watching the train speed toward him. He needed to build a bridge, and he needed to build it immediately. Carter and I sat in my basement office, monitoring his every digital move. We had placed a silent tracking program on his corporate laptop. We could see his screen in real time. We watched him open his accounting software and stare at the massive deficits. He was sweating. We could not see his face, but the frantic, erratic movements of his mouse cursor told the entire story of his panic. He tried to log into his traditional banking portals, but Arthur Sterling had built an impenetrable wall. The screens simply flashed red warning messages stating his accounts were restricted and directing him to contact a branch administrator. Trevor clicked the warnings away furiously. He knew he could not call the bank. He knew they would ask questions he could not answer. He needed a bridge loan. He needed a massive injection of liquid capital to plug the gaping holes in his corporate accounts before the auditors arrived. If he could secure a short-term high-interest loan, he could replace the stolen money. He could show the auditors a healthy balance sheet. He could pass the inspection and then figure out how to pay back the loan later. It was the desperate logic of a gambling addict trying to cover a bad bet with another bad bet. He thought he could outrun his own shadow. We watched him open a search engine. He typed in queries for aggressive commercial lenders. He looked for private equity firms that specialized in distressed assets and fast capital injections. He bypassed the highly regulated national banks and looked for the shadow lenders. He wanted institutions that asked fewer questions and moved money quickly. He was looking for a lifeline in the darkest corners of the financial sector. I placed my hand on Carter's shoulder. I told him it was time to cast the line. Carter nodded and brought up a secondary server. Years ago, I had established a boutique private lending firm for exactly this type of scenario. It was a fully licensed operational entity, but it remained dormant until I needed to use it. We called it Apex Capital Solutions. It had a sleek professional website that promised rapid corporate funding with minimal bureaucratic oversight. We catered to executives who needed liquidity without the intrusive probing of traditional banking auditors. Carter manipulated the search engine optimization algorithms. He pushed Apex Capital Solutions to the very top of the search results on Trevor Computer. We made it look like a highly exclusive, aggressively funded firm located just a few states over. It was the exact type of financial oasis a drowning man would swim toward. We did not have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, Trevor clicked on the link. We watched him navigate the website. He read the terms of service. He saw that we promised funding within 48 hours of application approval. He clicked on the commercial loan application portal, but then his cursor stopped moving. He hesitated. He knew that even a shadow lender would require proof of revenue. They would need to see his profit and loss statements. They would need to see his tax returns and his active shipping contracts. If he submitted his real documents, the lender would see a company on the verge of total collapse. They would laugh in his face and deny the loan. Trevor had reached the ultimate crossroads. He could admit defeat and prepare for federal prison, or he could double down on his own arrogance and commit one of the most severe financial crimes possible. He could lie. We sat in the dim light of my basement and watched human greed overcome basic survival instincts. Trevor opened his real financial documents and began to alter them. He opened a digital editing program and systematically erased the massive vendor payouts he had been funneling to his offshore accounts. He inflated his quarterly profits by 400%. He typed in phantom revenue streams. He created fake shipping manifests showing lucrative long-term contracts with massive retail suppliers. He was completely rewriting reality to make his hollow shell of a company look like a thriving logistics empire. Carter let out a low whistle of genuine astonishment. He told me that Trevor was not just tweaking the numbers. He was fabricating a completely alternate financial universe. He was forging federal tax documents. He was altering certified bank statements. Every single keystroke was adding years to his eventual prison sentence. He was sweating in his office trying to save his reputation, but he was actively writing his own federal indictment. I watched the screen with absolute coldness. This was the man who had mocked my faded coat. This was the man who had locked my daughter out in a blizzard. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he was untouchable. And here he was committing a textbook felony because he believed he was smarter than the system. It took him 3 hours to doctor the documents. When he was finally finished, he had created a masterpiece of absolute fiction. His fake portfolio showed a company bursting with liquid capital and guaranteed future revenue. It was exactly what a predatory lender would want to see. He saved the files into a single encrypted folder. He returned to the Apex Capital Solutions website. He filled out the online application. He entered his name, his social security number, and his corporate tax identification number. He requested a bridge loan of $5 million. He claimed in the application notes that the funds were needed for an aggressive expansion of his delivery fleet to meet the demands of his newly acquired contracts. In reality, $5 million was the exact amount he needed to replace the embezzled funds and pay off his mother's dangerous gambling debts before the corporate auditors arrived. He attached the fraudulent financial documents to the application. He checked the box indicating that all information provided was true and accurate under penalty of perjury. He hovered his mouse cursor over the submit button. We held our breath in the basement. We needed him to click that button. The moment the data transmitted across state lines, the crime would be complete. It would become federal wire fraud. Trevor clicked the button. The screen flashed a confirmation message thanking him for his application. Carter immediately intercepted the transmissions on our secure server. He pulled the digital package down and opened it. He isolated the digital signature Trevor had used to certify the documents. He isolated the Internet Protocol address, proving the transmission originated from Trevor's personal office computer. The chain of evidence was absolutely flawless. There could be no claims of hacking or mistaken identity. Trevor had personally and deliberately transmitted forged federal documents to secure a multi-million-dollar loan. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The trap was perfectly baited, and the prey had swallowed the hook completely. Trevor believed he had just found his salvation. He believed he was going to receive $5 million in unmarked corporate funds. He probably leaned back in his fancy leather chair and poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. He thought he had outsmarted the entire world. He had no idea that the man reviewing his fraudulent loan application was the same old man he had insulted at the mediation table. The countdown had officially begun, and his destruction was entirely guaranteed. The basement office was silent except for the low, constant hum of the servers. I sat in my leather chair, staring at the digital application glowing on the main monitor. Trevor had done it. He had actually done it. He had handed us a loaded weapon and placed the barrel directly against his own chest. Carter sat next to me sipping his cold coffee. He asked if I was ready to pull the trigger. I looked at the forged numbers on the screen. I saw the inflated revenue margins and the fake tax returns. I thought about my daughter crying on my porch in the freezing snow. I thought about my granddaughter wrapped in a wet blanket, shivering, because this arrogant coward decided they were disposable. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation. I leaned forward and placed my hand on the mouse. I clicked the green button on the screen that read, "Approve funding." It was a beautifully simple action, but the legal ramifications were absolute. By approving that loan from my private holding company, I officially authorized the disbursement of $5 million. But I was not sending the money to save his logistics firm. I was sending the money into a specifically monitored escrow account that Carter had established. The funds were completely real. They had to be real for the federal crime to stick. As soon as the money hit his corporate portal, the fraud would transition from an attempted crime to a fully executed federal felony. Trevor had used the internet to transmit forged documents across state lines to secure capital under false pretenses. It was wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny wrapped into one beautifully tied package. Less than an hour later, Carter intercepted a notification from the lending portal. Trevor had received the approval email. We watched the tracking program as Trevor opened the document. I could almost picture him sitting in his lavish downtown office, sweating through his expensive suit. He probably let out a massive sigh of relief when he saw the $5 million approval notice. He was so desperate to save his own skin that he completely ignored the basic rules of financial diligence. He did not ask questions about the lending firm. He did not read the dense legal covenants buried in the terms and conditions. He scrolled straight to the bottom of the digital contract. Carter pointed at the screen. "He is initiating the digital signature protocol," Carter whispered. His voice was thick with anticipation. We watched the keystrokes register in real time. Trevor typed his full legal name. He clicked the box that certified he was the primary guarantor and that all provided information was truthful under penalty of perjury. He hit submit. The encrypted packet zipped back to our server. Carter immediately locked the file. He isolated the digital certificate, the internet protocol address, and the exact timestamp down to the millisecond. It was pristine, untainted evidence. The money transferred into his corporate account immediately after. Trevor had officially swallowed the hook. The barb was set deep in his throat, and there was absolutely no way for him to spit it out. I told Carter to patch into the audio surveillance we had managed to piggyback onto Trevor's corporate phone line. I wanted to hear the exact moment his arrogance returned. It did not take long. Within 10 minutes, Trevor made a phone call. He did not call his accountant or his corporate officers. He called his mother. The line clicked, and Beverly answered. Trevor was laughing. It was a loud, obnoxious sound of pure, unadulterated hubris. "Mom," he cheered into the receiver. "We are completely clear. I secured the bridge loan. $5 million just hit the corporate portal. We are totally liquid again." Beverly let out a dramatic sigh of relief. "I told you everything would work out." She praised him. "You are a genius, Trevor. You always find a way to win." "What about the auditors?" Trevor scoffed loudly. "Let the auditors come," he bragged. "The accounts are completely flush. I will replace the missing capital balance, the ledgers, and those suits will not find a single thing out of place. Once they sign off on the quarterly review, I will use the remaining capital to aggressively expand the fleet and pay the loan back before the end of the year. It is foolproof." I sat in my basement, listening to two criminals congratulate each other on their own perceived brilliance. They truly believed they had outsmarted the entire financial system. They thought they had erased their embezzlement and secured their luxurious future. They were celebrating a victory while standing on a trapdoor. They did not know that the $5 million sitting in his account was highly radioactive. Carter had tagged every single digital dollar. If Trevor tried to move those funds to cover his stolen investor money, He would leave an undeniable trail of evidence directly to his own guilt. But Trevor was not satisfied with merely surviving his corporate audit. Drunk on his new infusion of stolen power, he decided it was time to tie up his loose ends. He felt invincible again, and an invincible predator always looks for someone to crush. I listened as his tone on the phone shifted from celebratory to deeply malicious. Now that the company is secure, Trevor told his mother, I am cutting the dead weight permanently. I am finalizing the divorce from Natalie today. I am not giving her another penny, and I am taking Lily. Beverly eagerly agreed. It is about time, she hissed. You have wasted enough time on that pathetic woman. Her and that useless father of hers need to learn their place. Trevor chuckled darkly. Oh, they are going to learn, he promised. I am having the corporate lawyers draft her termination papers right now. That piece of information made my blood run cold. When Natalie and Trevor first started the logistics company, Natalie had served as a primary advisory officer. She had helped him build the routing algorithms that made the company profitable in its early years. She was officially listed as an employee on the corporate payroll. It was her only source of independent health insurance and her only documented income stream. Trevor did not just want to divorce her. He wanted to obliterate her. We watched his screen as he drafted an email to his human resources director. He instructed them to terminate Natalie employment effective immediately. He ordered them to revoke her health insurance coverage and deny any severance package citing gross negligence and abandonment of marital duties. He was trying to strip her of her ability to buy medicine for my granddaughter. He was trying to leave her absolutely destitute before the weekend arrived. He wanted her to crawl back to him on her hands and knees, begging for scraps so he could laugh in her face. He sent the termination email without a second thought. He then forwarded the finalized divorce settlement to his ruthless lawyers, instructing them to serve her with extreme prejudice. He leaned back in his chair, believing he had just conquered the world. He believed he had secured his mistress, his fortune, and his absolute freedom. He prepared to walk out of his office a victorious king. He had absolutely no idea that his crown was made of paper, and I was already holding the match. I looked at Carter. It was time to pull the curtain down on this entire charade. I told Carter to begin compiling the evidence packets for the federal authorities. We were going to show Trevor exactly what happens when you push my family too far. Trevor had forwarded a portion of his newly acquired bridge loan directly to his mother the very moment he believed the funds were secure. Beverly had wasted absolutely no time. Her ultimate obsession had always been the Oakmont Valley Country Club. It was the most exclusive sanctuary of old money and high society in our entire region. Membership was strictly by invitation only. The initiation fee alone was $250,000. Beverly had been clawing at the gates of Oakmont for a decade. She was desperate to rub shoulders with the generational wealth she so intensely wanted to mimic. With Trevor handing her a stolen corporate lifeline, she thought she finally had the golden ticket to buy her way into the inner circle. She scheduled her formal initiation luncheon for that very Saturday afternoon. She invited the wives of local politicians, the heirs of manufacturing dynasties, and the elite socialites she had been trying to impress for years. They gathered in the grand dining room overlooking the 18th hole, sipping expensive champagne beneath vaulted mahogany ceilings. Beverly wore a new designer gown draped in heavy pearls, acting as if she had just conquered the entire world. What Beverly did not know was that Oakmont Valley was not just a golf club. It was a private institution founded by a small consortium of commercial real estate developers 30 years ago. I was one of those founders. I still sat on the anonymous executive board that vetted every single financial transaction and approved every single membership. I had personally authorized her preliminary invitation just so I could personally watch her burn it to ashes. I walked into the grand dining room just as the club president prepared to formally welcome Beverly into the fold. I did not wear my faded corduroy coat. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit that commanded the immediate respect of every single person in the room. The local politicians and corporate executives nodded to me with quiet deference as I passed their tables. Beverly was standing near the grand fireplace holding a crystal flute of champagne. She was mid-sentence bragging about her son and his massive logistics empire. When she saw me approach, her smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered her composure, assuming I had somehow sneaked into the building to beg for my daughter. She hissed under her breath, demanding to know what I was doing there, as I stepped directly into her circle of wealthy guests. She asked if I had gotten lost looking for the service entrance and threatened that security would remove me if I did not leave immediately. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power speaks softly. I told her smoothly that I was afraid there had been a slight administrative issue with her initiation. The club president stepped to my side, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He held a silver tray bearing a pristine white envelope. He stated loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear that he was deeply sorry, but the wire transfer she submitted that morning for her initiation fee had been declined by the Federal Banking Authority. He announced that the funds were non-existent. Beverly turned pale. The crystal flute trembled in her manicured hand. She snapped that it was impossible, and her voice pitched upward in panic. She claimed her son had just wired her $250,000 from his corporate account. She demanded that they call the bank again and asked if they knew who she was. I stepped forward and removed a folded document from my jacket pocket. I replied that they knew exactly who she was, and my voice cut clearly through the quiet murmur of the dining room. I told her she was a woman with over $800,000 in underground gambling debts. I told the room she was a woman who relied on unlicensed loan sharks. I declared she was a woman surviving entirely on funds her son embezzled from his own investors. The wealthy socialites surrounding her physically took a step back. The silence in the room was absolute. Beverly gasped for air like a fish thrown onto the dock. She shrieked that I was lying. She called me a pathetic old man trying to ruin her family because her son threw my worthless daughter out on the street. I handed the document to the club president. It was a certified financial freeze notice issued by the regional director of her bank. I told her coldly that I was not lying. I explained that her son attempted to secure a fraudulent bridge loan to cover the money she had gambled away. I revealed that the account was flagged for wire fraud the moment he signed the contract, and that every penny to her name was currently locked under a federal investigation. I told her that her son was entirely broke, and so was she. She looked frantically around the room, begging her wealthy friends for support. She met nothing but averted eyes and expressions of absolute disgust. High society forgives many things, but they never forgive a thief who tries to steal their prestige. I continued speaking as a senior member of the executive board of the club. I formally denied her application for membership. Furthermore, I told her she was permanently banned from the premises. 2 private security guards stepped forward from the shadows of the dining room archway. They did not touch her, but their presence was an undeniable command. Beverly looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost visible. But beneath the hatred was the crushing realization of her absolute ruin. She dropped her champagne glass on a silver tray and practically ran toward the exit. She pushed past the elite members she had spent a decade trying to impress. She was leaving as a complete outcast, an exposed fraud, and a public disgrace. Her social execution was flawless. Her entire world of fake luxury had evaporated in less than 5 minutes, leaving her with absolutely nothing but her own shame. Now it was time to tear down the son she had raised. Monday morning arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to freeze the very air inside the city limits. I woke up early long before the sun even considered rising over the horizon. I made a pot of black coffee and sat at my kitchen table listening to the quiet breathing of my granddaughter sleeping safely in the next room. Natalie was already awake, sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Today was the day her husband intended to sever her entirely from the logistics company they had built together. He had drafted the termination papers on Friday, completely convinced that he held all the power. He planned to march into his executive suite, summon the human resources director, and officially strip the mother of his child of her health insurance and her dignity. He wanted to start his week by crushing a woman he thought was entirely defenseless. I looked at my daughter and told her to stay home and relax. I told her I had an errand to run across town. I put on my tailored midnight blue suit, draped a heavy wool overcoat across my shoulders, and walked out to my truck. I was not going to let him enjoy a single second of his morning. The headquarters of Trevor and his logistics empire was located in a sprawling commercial park on the industrial side of the city. It was a massive facility with rows of loading docks and a sleek glass-fronted executive building. Trevor loved that building. He loved the massive polished metal sign above the entrance that bore his last name. He believed it was a monument to his own self-made brilliance. I parked my old truck at the far end of the employee lot, blending in perfectly with the delivery vehicles and maintenance vans. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling and the heater blowing warm air against my face. I watched the main entrance through my windshield. It was exactly 8 in the morning. The parking lot was supposed to be filled with dispatchers and routing managers arriving for their shifts. Instead, the lot was entirely dominated by a fleet of unmarked black sport utility vehicles and several large panel vans. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs were moving systematically through the building. The federal authorities had not waited for Trevor to arrive. They had executed the search warrants at dawn. Right on schedule, Trevor pulled into the executive parking space in his leased German sports car. He parked diagonally across 2 spaces, an arrogant habit he displayed everywhere he went. He stepped out of his vehicle, holding a customized leather briefcase and wearing a razor-sharp gray suit. He was whistling a cheerful tune as he walked toward the main entrance. He was completely oblivious to the black vehicles surrounding his building. His mind was entirely focused on the termination papers waiting in his briefcase. He walked up to the towering glass doors of the executive lobby and pulled the handle. The door did not budge. He pulled it again harder this time, and his brow furrowed in irritation. He looked down and noticed a heavy industrial steel padlock securing the handles together from the inside. A bright orange notice of seizure was taped directly to the center of the glass at eye level. Trevor squinted at the paper, and his cheerful demeanor was instantly replaced by aggressive annoyance. He assumed it was a bureaucratic mistake, or a simple administrative error regarding his municipal zoning permits. He banged his fist against the glass, demanding that the receptionist open the door immediately. A man wearing a federal windbreaker stepped into the lobby from the interior hallway. He walked over to the glass doors and unlocked the padlock, pushing one side open just enough to step out into the freezing morning air. Trevor immediately puffed up his chest, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate the federal agent. He demanded to know what was going on and why his corporate offices were locked during standard business hours. He shouted that he was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar enterprise and that they were trespassing on his private property. He threatened to call his corporate lawyers and sue the city for lost revenue. The federal agent did not even blink. He calmly held up his hand and informed Trevor that the building was currently closed to all civilian personnel under a federal warrant. Trevor let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He waved his hand dismissively and told the agent that this was clearly a misunderstanding regarding his scheduled quarterly audit. He bragged that his accountants were already preparing the ledgers and that this dramatic show of force was completely unnecessary. He insisted that his accounts were flush with fresh capital and that the auditors would not find a single penny out of place. While Trevor stood on the concrete steps complaining about the inconvenience, the main double doors were propped wide open. A team of Internal Revenue Service agents and federal forensic auditors began marching out of the building. They were not carrying simple file folders. They were carrying massive plastic bins, completely filled with hard drives, physical server towers, and every single paper ledger Trevor kept in his private office. Trevor stopped mid-sentence. His arrogant smirk finally faltered as he watched an agent carry his personal encrypted laptop out the door and load it into the back of a panel van. He lunged forward, yelling that they had absolutely no right to seize his proprietary routing algorithms. He shouted that his investors would not stand for this level of governmental overreach. He promised that his wealthy backers would rain absolute hellfire down on whoever authorized this ridiculous raid. A woman stepped out of the lobby following the team of agents. She was the lead federal auditor and a stern, meticulously organized professional holding a thick clipboard. She walked directly up to Trevor. She did not raise her voice, but her words cut through the freezing morning air with lethal precision. She informed him that this was not a routine quarterly audit. She stated clearly that his entire operation was currently being seized under federal statutes regarding wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. Trevor physically stumbled backward. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He shook his head frantically, stammering that there was no money laundering. He claimed he had just secured a totally legitimate bridge loan from a private equity firm to cover his temporary operational deficits. He shouted that his company was completely solvent and that his primary debt holders would vouch for his financial integrity. He demanded that they call the private equity firm that had just injected $5 million into his corporate portal. The lead auditor looked at Trevor with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. It was the exact same look of pity Trevor had used when he offered to buy my coffee at family dinners. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her clipboard. She told him that they had already spoken to the primary debt holder. She explained that the $5 million bridge loan he secured had automatically triggered the federal raid because the financial documents he submitted contained dozens of forged signatures and fabricated tax returns. She held the document out to him. It was the master debt ledger for his entire logistics company, detailing the complete chain of ownership for the very building he was standing outside of. Trevor snatched the paper from her hand with trembling fingers. His eyes darted across the dense legal text. He looked for the name of the anonymous private equity firm he had submitted his fraudulent loan application to. Instead, his eyes locked onto the name of the primary personal guarantor and the sole proprietor of the holding company that owned his debt. He read my name. I opened the door of my old truck and stepped out onto the frozen pavement. The sound of my boots crunching against the icy asphalt drew his attention. Trevor slowly lifted his head from the document. He looked across the parking lot and saw me walking toward him. I was not shuffling and I was not slouching. I walked with the heavy, undeniable stride of a man who owned the very ground Trevor stood upon. Trevor stared at me while his mouth opened and closed silently. He looked at my tailored suit, recognizing for the very first time that the pathetic old insurance clerk he had mocked for years was a complete fabrication. He realized that the man he had locked out in a blizzard was the architect of his total destruction. Trevor dropped his custom leather briefcase. It hit the icy concrete with a dull thud, spilling his carefully drafted termination papers across the frozen ground. He looked at the federal agents seizing his servers, and then he looked back at me. He raised a shaking hand and pointed a finger in my direction. "You," he gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "You did this. You set me up. You owned the lending firm." I stopped just a few feet away from him. I looked at the panicked, broken man who had tried to leave my daughter destitute. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached gaze of a corporate executioner. I told him that I did not force him to forge federal tax documents. I told him I did not force him to steal millions of dollars from his own investors to buy a penthouse for his mistress. I told him I did not force his mother to gamble away hundreds of thousands of dollars. I simply provided the rope and he eagerly tied the noose around his own neck. Trevor dropped to his knees right there on the frozen pavement. The federal agents ignored his breakdown entirely, stepping around him as they continued to load the last of his shattered empire into their vehicles. He was completely alone, utterly bankrupt, and staring directly into the face of his own catastrophic arrogance. I turned my back on him, walking away as the lead auditor formally advised him of his right to remain silent. It was a right he should have learned a very long time ago. Trevor remained on the icy pavement, while the federal agents continued to dismantle his fraudulent empire. His tailored suit was soaking wet from the melting snow, but he could not feel the cold. He could only feel the crushing weight of his absolute failure. His mind raced frantically, looking for a single remaining exit strategy. He ignored the federal auditor who was attempting to hand him a formal subpoena. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive shoes slipping on the ice. He remembered the offshore account in the Bahamas. He had wired a portion of his early embezzled funds there months ago. It was supposed to be his ultimate safety net. He had placed the account entirely under the name of his mistress, Monica, to hide the assets from my daughter during the divorce. He believed that money was safe. He patted his pockets frantically and pulled out his cell phone. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks from dropping his briefcase, but the device still functioned. He stumbled away from the executive lobby, moving toward the edge of the parking lot, where the snow was piled high against the chain-link fence. He needed to call Monica immediately. He needed her to access the Bahamian account and secure a high-powered defense attorney. He needed her to buy 2 first-class tickets out of the country before the authorities froze his passport. He dialed her number with shaking fingers. He paced back and forth in the snow, his breath coming out in frantic white clouds. The phone rang multiple times. Each ring stretched his panic further until it felt like a physical pain in his chest. Finally, the line connected. Monica answered, but the background noise on her end was overwhelming. Trevor heard the distinct echo of public intercom announcements and the heavy rhythmic sound of rolling luggage. She was in a massive open space. She was at the airport. Trevor did not even ask how she was doing. He launched directly into a desperate, frantic plea. He told her the federal authorities had raided his corporate headquarters. He told her my private equity firm had seized his debt and tricked him into committing wire fraud. He begged her to log into their offshore accounts immediately. He told her to wire every single dollar to a secure, untraceable holding firm so he could hire a legal team and join her on the next flight out of the country. Monica did not respond, with the sweet, supportive tone she had used when he was buying her diamond necklaces. She did not offer him comfort or reassurance. Instead, she let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut through the phone line like a jagged knife. She told him to stop giving her orders. She told him he was no longer a wealthy logistics executive giving commands to his loyal partner. She called him a pathetic, broke fraud. Trevor stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still in the freezing snow, totally confused by her sudden venom. He begged her to listen to him and insisted they still had millions secured in the island accounts. Monica laughed again, louder this time. She told him there was absolutely no money left in any of those accounts. She explained exactly what had happened over her weekend. She told him the eviction notice she received from the building management on Friday was completely real. She told him that first thing Monday morning, the management company had arrived with security guards and a locksmith. They had physically removed her from the luxury penthouse he had promised her. She told him she had to watch building personnel carry her designer clothes and expensive furniture out into the hallway. She told him she was humiliated in front of all her wealthy neighbors. She demanded to know why he had lied to her. She screamed into the phone that he had promised her a life of luxury and high society, but he had only provided her with stolen funds and a fake lifestyle. Trevor pleaded with her, stating that the real estate issue was just a minor setback. He begged her to just check the offshore balances. Monica told him she had already checked them the moment she was kicked out of the condo. She explained that she saw the federal warnings pending on the massive bridge loan he had tried to deposit. She knew the federal authorities were closing in on his assets, but she also saw the original untainted funds he had hidden there months ago. She told him she did not wait for the government to freeze those funds too. She told him she had immediately contacted a digital broker. She drained every single clean dollar from that offshore account and transferred it all into an anonymous, untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. She took everything. Trevor fell to his knees in the snow. He begged her not to do this. He cried into the phone, telling her he loved her and that he had ruined his marriage and abandoned his daughter just to build a life with her. Monica told him he was a fool. She said she was standing at the international departure gate, waiting to board a flight to a country that did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. She told him she was not going to spend the best years of her life rotting in a federal prison as an accessory to his massive corporate fraud. She told him she was taking the remaining cash as compensation for the trauma he had put her through. She called him a worthless liar who bought his confidence on credit. She told him to completely forget her name and to never try to contact her again. The line went completely dead. Trevor lowered the cracked phone from his ear. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the quiet winter air. His breathing became ragged. The icy wind cut through his expensive suit, but the chill in his veins came from the absolute void Monica had just left him in. He had traded his family for a woman who viewed him strictly as an automated teller machine. He had destroyed his daughter to build a palace for a parasite. When the money stopped flowing, the loyalty instantly evaporated. Monica did not see a brilliant chief executive officer fighting a temporary legal battle. She saw a sinking ship, and she had eagerly stolen the only remaining lifeboat. Trevor felt his hands hit the frozen pavement. The physical shock of the ice was nothing compared to the psychological devastation crashing down upon him. He had spent years meticulously cultivating the image of an untouchable corporate titan. He demanded respect from his employees and subservience from his wife. He thrived on the illusion of his own superiority. Now that illusion was violently stripped away. He was reduced to a weeping beggar in a snowy parking lot, pleading with a woman who was already boarding an international flight with his stolen money. He slowly turned his head to look back toward the center of the parking lot. The federal agents were moving with clinical efficiency. They were sealing his building with bright orange stickers and padlocks. And beyond the agents standing near the edge of the employee lot, I remained completely motionless. I watched him with a cold, detached satisfaction. Trevor looked at my calm expression, and his mind finally connected the catastrophic events of the past few days. The timing was simply too perfect. His personal bank accounts had been frozen by a regional director mere hours after he tried to starve my daughter financially. His mistress was evicted by the property holding company the very next day. His mother was publicly humiliated at the elite country club precisely when she tried to spend his stolen funds. And the shadow lender that approved his fraudulent bridge loan, the lender that immediately triggered the federal audit, was owned by the very man standing across the parking lot. He realized he had not been struck by a string of bad luck. He had been systematically dismantled by a mastermind. He realized that the quiet elderly man who served him coffee at family dinners was actually a ruthless architect of corporate destruction. He had poked a sleeping bear, thinking it was a stray dog. I had not just matched his cruelty, I had overwhelmed it with undeniable financial force. I let him build his fragile house of cards as high as he possibly could, just so the fall would shatter every single bone in his ego. He had mocked my faded corduroy coat. He had laughed at my modest home. He had told his lawyers that I was a fragile old man living on a pathetic fixed pension. He had locked my daughter and my granddaughter out in a blizzard because he firmly believed I was completely powerless to stop him. Now he understood that I was not a weak old man. I was a financial leviathan. I had allowed him to believe he was an apex predator, while I quietly built a cage around his entire world. I had dismantled his marriage, his business, his finances, his mistress, and his mother in less than a single weekend. I did not just defeat him, I erased him. 2 federal agents noticed Trevor kneeling in the snow at the edge of the property. They walked over to him, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. Trevor did not try to run. He did not try to argue or brag about his corporate standing. He simply let the phone slip from his frozen fingers into the snow. He raised his hands and surrendered. The agents pulled his arms behind his back and locked the cuffs around his wrists. They read him his rights as they marched him toward the back of a federal vehicle. He kept his eyes locked on me the entire time. There was no arrogance left in his gaze. There was only absolute, profound terror. He finally knew exactly who my daughter was, and he finally understood exactly who her father was. 6 weeks had passed since the frozen morning in the parking lot. Federal justice moves with an agonizing slowness that is designed to break a man completely. Trevor had managed to secure his temporary release on bail, but the cost was absolute ruin. He had convinced his mother to pawn the last of her vintage jewelry to a predatory bondsman just to keep him out of a holding cell while he awaited his formal trial. He was no longer a high-flying logistics executive. He was a ghost haunting his own life. His accounts remained frozen. His corporate assets were fully seized. His luxury cars were impounded by the federal authorities. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and his trial was approaching with the terrifying speed of a runaway train. The annual Logistics and Investment Gala was held in the Grand Ballroom of the City Center Hotel. It was the most exclusive corporate event of the year. It was a gathering of billionaires, venture capitalists, and industry titans who had enough disposable income to buy a distressed company with a single signature. Trevor knew he had only one extremely desperate option left to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. He needed liquid cash to hire a premier criminal defense team, or to pay a smuggler to get him across a border without a passport. He needed a miracle. Trevor did not have an invitation. His membership to the corporate syndicate had been formally revoked the day his company was raided. He arrived at the hotel shivering in the bitter January wind. He was wearing his only remaining clean suit. It was a dark gray wool blend that hung loosely on his frame because the stress of the impending federal indictment had caused him to lose 15 pounds. He slipped past the main security checkpoint by blending into a large group of catering staff entering through the loading docks. He navigated the service corridors with the frantic energy of a hunted animal until he finally pushed through a set of heavy velvet curtains and stepped into the grand ballroom. The sheer opulence of the event was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with top-shelf champagne and imported delicacies. The low hum of wealthy conversation filled the massive space, accompanied by the soft melodies of a live string quartet playing in the corner. For Trevor, the sight of all this wealth was physically painful. Just a few short months ago, he would have walked into this room expecting people to clear a path for him. He would have stood near the grand fireplace, bragging about his expanding fleets and his beautiful young mistress. Now he was a desperate trespasser, hiding near the edges of the room, terrified that the security guards would recognize him and throw him out onto the icy street. Trevor began to move through the crowd, hovering near the edges of different conversations. He was hunting for a lifeline. He approached two former business associates, begging them for a private meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial financial arrangement. They looked at him as if he were carrying a highly infectious disease. They turned their backs on him and walked away without saying a single word. His reputation was entirely radioactive. No legitimate investor would ever touch a man carrying federal wire fraud charges. But as Trevor retreated toward the shadows of the ballroom, he heard a quiet rumor circulating among a group of desperate startup founders. They were whispering about the keynote speaker scheduled for the evening. They referred to him only as the Silent Whale. He was an urban legend in the commercial real estate and private equity sectors. He was an anonymous billionaire who specialized in buying heavily distressed assets and bailing out failing executives for pennies on the dollar. The rumor was that he had emerged from a decade of quiet retirement, specifically to make a massive acquisition tonight. Trevor felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope. This was exactly the miracle he needed. If he could corner this legendary investor after the speech, he could beg for a bailout. He would offer to sign over the remaining intellectual property rights of his logistics algorithms. He would offer to be a silent partner. He would do whatever it took to secure enough cash to flee the country before his trial date. He pushed his way toward the front of the ballroom, aggressively maneuvering his way through the crowd of wealthy attendees. He needed to be the very first person to shake the hand of the Silent Whale when the man stepped down from the podium. The string quartet stopped playing. The golden chandeliers dimmed significantly, signaling the beginning of the main event. A spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. The president of the investment syndicate stepped up to the microphone. He spoke with deep reverence about a man who had built a financial empire from nothing. He spoke of a pioneer who had reshaped the commercial real estate landscape across the entire Midwest. He announced that the syndicate was profoundly honored to welcome the legendary founder of Apex Capital Solutions to the stage. Trevor clapped his hands together, his palms sweating profusely. He was ready to drop to his knees and beg this titan for a second chance. He stared eagerly at the heavy velvet curtains behind the podium, waiting for his savior to emerge. The curtains parted. A man stepped forward into the bright white beam of the spotlight. He was not walking with a stooped posture. He was not wearing a faded corduroy coat. He was dressed in a flawlessly tailored bespoke black tuxedo that fit him with absolute perfection. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture radiated an undeniable, terrifying power. He looked like absolute royalty surveying his vast kingdom. Trevor stopped clapping. The breath caught violently in his throat. His eyes widened to the point of pain as he stared at the stage. His legs suddenly lost all of their strength, and he had to grab the back of a nearby chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpeted floor. He recognized the broad shoulders. He recognized the steady, calculating eyes. The silent whale, the legendary billionaire who held the power to save or destroy entire corporations, was not a stranger. It was the man who had served him coffee in a quiet suburban kitchen. It was the man he had mocked at the mediation table. It was Natalie's father. It was me. Trevor stood frozen in the crowd, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He finally understood that he had never been the predator. He had been swimming in a very small pond, completely unaware that a leviathan was patiently waiting in the deep water. The trap he had walked into was not just a legal maneuver. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial warfare, and he was looking directly at the architect. I stepped down from the podium. The applause was deafening, echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom. I walked down the center aisle, nodding to the billionaires and industry titans who parted like the Red Sea to let me through. I was not looking at them. My eyes were locked entirely on the haggard, trembling figure standing near the back of the room. Trevor was frozen, his mouth slightly open, his tailored suit hanging off his shrinking frame. He looked exactly like what he was, a rat trapped in a room full of lions. As I approached, the reality of his absolute ruin finally shattered the last remaining pieces of his sanity. He did not retreat. He lunged forward, pushing past a group of venture capitalists. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, his face contorted with a frantic, unhinged rage. He screamed that I had set him up. He yelled that I stole his company and ruined his life. His voice cracked and bounced off the crystal chandeliers. The surrounding guests immediately fell silent. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the city turned to stare at the madman, yelling at their keynote speaker. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at him with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. I adjusted the cuffs of my tuxedo and let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. I told him softly that I did not steal his company. My voice carried no anger, only the freezing weight of absolute authority. I explained that he dismantled his own company the moment he decided to steal from his investors to fund a luxury condo for his mistress. I told him I simply bought the wreckage he left behind. He shook his head violently, spittle flying from his lips. He yelled that I was a liar, stepping closer with eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He accused me of framing him with the bridge loan and forging the audits. He shouted that he was a self-made millionaire and a chief executive. He called me a pathetic old man, trying to destroy him because he left my worthless daughter. The collective gasp from the ballroom was audible. Insulting my daughter in front of my professional peers was his final, fatal mistake. I looked past him up toward the darkened audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. I gave a single, barely perceptible nod. Carter was waiting. He had tapped directly into the hotel projection system. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage suddenly blinked to life, casting a bright, harsh light over the entire crowd. The ballroom plunged into total darkness, leaving only the glowing screens to illuminate Trevor's terrified face. The first image was not a financial document. It was a high-definition security video. It showed my front porch on a freezing December night in the middle of a blinding blizzard. The video played without sound, but the visual was devastating. The crowd watched in absolute horror as my daughter Natalie stood shivering in the snow, clutching my 5-year-old granddaughter Lily, wrapped in a soaked blanket. They saw the trash bags full of clothes sitting at their feet. They saw the sheer terror and heartbreak on a young mother's face. I turned back to Trevor. I told him that was what he did. My voice echoed through the silent room. I told him he locked his own child out in a blizzard to move another woman into her home. I explained that he thought he was throwing them out into the street, but he did not realize he was dropping them directly into my fortress. Trevor stared at the screen, his breath hitching in his throat. He tried to speak, but the screen shifted before he could form a word. The video vanished, replaced by a massive, unavoidable spread of corporate ledgers. The numbers were highlighted in bright red. The crowd, comprised entirely of financial experts, instantly understood what they were looking at. They saw the phantom consulting fees. They saw the systematic siphoning of investor capital. They saw the exact routing numbers transferring millions of dollars into an offshore shell account registered in the Bahamas. I announced calmly that this was his brilliance. I told him this was his self-made empire. I called him a common thief who spent his investors' money on luxury cars and a downtown penthouse while complaining that his wife spent too much on groceries. The final blow hit the screens with the impact of a sledgehammer. The ledgers disappeared, replaced by the digital loan application he had submitted to my shadow lending firm. It was blown up to massive proportions. The fabricated tax returns were displayed side by side with the real hollowed-out corporate balances. And right at the bottom of the screen, magnified for every single person in the room to see, was Trevor's signature. It was accompanied by the digital certificate, the internet protocol address, and the exact timestamp. I told him he thought he was outsmarting the federal auditors. I stepped so close I could see the sweat dripping down his temples. I told him he thought he was securing a secret lifeline. Instead, he voluntarily transmitted forged federal documents across state lines. I told him he signed a full confession to wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny, and he sent it directly to my personal server. Trevor's legs finally gave out. The sheer crushing reality of his public execution shattered his knees. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor of the grand ballroom, right in front of the most powerful people in the industry. He covered his face with his shaking hands, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sob that echoed through the dead, silent room. He was no longer a corporate officer. He was not a millionaire. He was a ruined, broke, exposed criminal weeping on the floor in a borrowed suit. He begged me to turn the screens off. He begged me to make it stop. I looked down at the weeping shell of a man who had tried to destroy my bloodline. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I leaned down so only he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I reminded him that he told my daughter she was nothing. I reminded him that he called her weak and said I was a nobody. I told him he believed his own lies so deeply that he forgot the most basic rule of survival. I whispered that you never go to war unless you know exactly who you are fighting. Trevor stood completely paralyzed in the center of the grand ballroom. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The surrounding crowd of billionaires and corporate executives stared at him with expressions of absolute disgust. He was entirely exposed. Every lie he had ever told, every dollar he had ever stolen, and every cruelty he had ever inflicted on his family was currently projected on massive screens for his entire professional network to see. I watched his eyes dart toward the main exit doors, hoping for a miracle escape. He did not realize that I had sealed every single exit long before I stepped onto the stage. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. They did not open for a catering cart or a late-arriving guest. They were pushed open by a coordinated team of federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying official badges. Carter had timed their arrival perfectly. The agents moved with a swift, silent efficiency that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. They walked straight down the center aisle, parting the crowd of wealthy attendees. The lead agent did not yell or create a dramatic scene. He simply walked directly up to Trevor, holding a thick stack of federal warrants. Trevor tried to step back, but his legs were completely devoid of strength. He raised his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. He stammered that this was a mistake. He tried to tell the agent that he was a respected logistics executive and that his corporate lawyers would resolve the misunderstanding immediately. The lead agent did not even blink. He calmly informed Trevor that his corporate lawyers had formally resigned their representation the moment the federal indictments were unsealed. He stated clearly that Trevor was being placed under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion. The agent reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Trevor panicked. The reality of his absolute ruin finally shattered his carefully constructed arrogance. He dropped to his knees right there on the carpeted floor of the grand ballroom. He looked up at the agent with tears streaming down his face, begging for a chance to explain. He claimed that he only stole the money to protect his company and that his mother had forced him to cover her gambling debts. Even in his final moments of freedom, he was desperately trying to blame the women in his life for his own catastrophic decisions. The federal agent ignored his pathetic excuses entirely. He grabbed Trevor's arms, pulling them roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly in the silent room. As the agents pulled Trevor to his feet, they informed him that his mother Beverly was also currently being arrested at her country club luncheon. They told him she was facing federal complicity charges and felony elder assault for attacking me at the elementary school. Trevor stopped struggling. The news of his mother's arrest completely broke whatever fight he had left in him. He realized that the destruction of his empire was absolute. The agents marched him down the center aisle toward the exit doors. The crowd of wealthy investors watched him pass in total silence. They did not offer him pity. They offered him the cold, detached judgment reserved for a fraud who had tried to steal from their ranks. As Trevor passed the podium, he stopped and looked up at me. His eyes were red and swollen. He begged me to help him. He begged me to think of my granddaughter and the pain this would cause her. I looked down at the weeping, broken man in handcuffs. I told him quietly that my granddaughter was the only reason he was still breathing. I told him that I had protected my bloodline and that he was simply the trash I had to take out to ensure her safety. I turned my back on him, returning my attention to the podium. The federal agents pushed Trevor through the heavy mahogany doors and out of the ballroom, ending his life as a free man forever. The silence in the room stretched for a long moment after the doors closed. I adjusted the microphone on the podium and looked out over the crowd of stunned executives. I cleared my throat and spoke with calm, undeniable authority. I apologized to the attendees for the dramatic interruption, but explained that I firmly believed in cleaning my own house before conducting any new business. I told them that the logistics company previously owned by the man who was just escorted out was now officially a subsidiary of my private holding firm. I invited anyone interested in investing in a thoroughly restructured, cleanly audited enterprise to meet with my representatives in the lobby. The crowd erupted in a massive wave of applause. They were not clapping for the destruction of a fraud. They were clapping for the sheer terrifying power of the silent whale who had just executed a hostile takeover in front of their very eyes. The execution was complete. The trap had fully snapped shut, crushing every single bone in Trevor's arrogant ego. He was going to spend decades in a federal penitentiary, and his mother was going to join him. I stepped down from the podium, feeling a profound sense of peace. The monsters had been completely eradicated, and my family was finally safe. I walked out of the ballroom through a side door, leaving the executives to scramble for investment opportunities. My driver was waiting in the alley behind the hotel with the engine of my unassuming truck idling in the cold air. I climbed into the passenger seat and pulled out my phone. I dialed my daughter's number. She answered on the very first ring. I told Natalie that it was over. I told her that Trevor and Beverly were in federal custody and that the logistics company was fully secured under our holding firm. I heard her let out a long, shaky sigh of absolute relief. I told her to put the kettle on because I was coming home to have hot cocoa with my granddaughter. The war was officially over, and the predators had absolutely no idea that they had been hunting an apex leviathan. 6 months have passed since that freezing night. The bitter winter that nearly broke my daughter has finally melted away. In its place is a warm and brilliant summer. I am sitting on the porch of my quiet suburban home. It is the exact same porch where my daughter stood shivering and terrified. Today, she is not crying. Today, she is completely untouchable. Trevor is currently residing in a federal penitentiary. He pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy public trial that would have exposed even more of his pathetic deceit. He traded his tailored Italian suits for an oversized orange jumpsuit. He traded his luxury downtown penthouse for a tiny concrete cell. He spends his days working in the prison laundry facility for pennies an hour. He has absolutely zero access to the internet. He has no offshore accounts and no mistresses to impress. He is completely stripped of the only thing he ever truly loved, which was his massive, fragile ego. He will remain behind those concrete walls for the next 14 years of his life, with nothing to do but think about the old man he mocked. His mother, Beverly, did not fare much better in the justice system. She was convicted of accessory to wire fraud and felony elder assault. She is serving a 5-year sentence at a state correctional facility. The woman who once draped herself in cashmere and pearls to beg for entry into the country club now wears standard-issue canvas uniforms. The wealthy socialites she tried so desperately to impress do not visit her. They do not write letters to her. To high society, she is worse than a criminal. She is a total public embarrassment. She sits in her cell knowing she threw away her freedom just to fund a gambling addiction and maintain a fake public image. Monica, the mistress, who fled to the islands, quickly discovered that stolen cryptocurrency is incredibly difficult to launder when federal agents flag your digital wallet. She was detained at an international customs checkpoint just 3 weeks after her flight. She is currently awaiting trial and cooperating fully with the authorities. They all turned on each other the very second the ship went down. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves when the money stops flowing. But the greatest transformation I have witnessed over these past 6 months belongs entirely to my daughter. Natalie did not just survive the financial execution her husband tried to inflict upon her. She took the logistics company he ruined and stripped it of its toxic debt. She worked tirelessly alongside Carter to completely restructure its operations from the ground up. She is now the chief executive officer of a fully solvent, cleanly audited, and highly profitable enterprise. She walks into boardrooms and commands absolute respect. She does not cower. She does not ask for permission. She learned the hardest possible lesson a person can learn about trust, and she forged it into impenetrable armor. I watch my granddaughter Lily running across the green grass of my front yard. She is chasing butterflies and laughing loudly in the warm afternoon sun. She does not remember the cold night she was locked out of her own home. She does not know about the forged signatures or the private equity traps. She only knows that she is safe and deeply loved. That is exactly how it should be. The innocent should be protected from the cruelty of the world. For decades, people have fundamentally misunderstood what true wealth actually means. Fools like Trevor believe wealth is a leased sports car parked diagonally across 2 spaces. Idiots like Beverly believe wealth is a country club membership bought with stolen money. They believe wealth is a loud, shiny weapon used to make other people feel small and insignificant. But they are entirely wrong. True wealth is totally silent. It does not need to boast or brag at family dinners. True wealth is the absolute unshakable power to protect your bloodline from monsters. It is the ability to stand quietly in a faded corduroy coat while knowing you hold the deed to the ground your enemies walk upon. True wealth gives you the patience to sit back, remain completely invisible, and simply hand arrogant predators the shovels they need to dig their own graves. I take a sip of my iced tea and watch the sun slowly dip below the tree line. My house is modest. My truck is 10 years old. I am just a quiet 71-year-old man living a simple, retired life. And I promise you that is exactly how I like it. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you learned something valuable from how I dismantled my arrogant son-in-law, let me know in the comments below. Stay strong, protect your family at all costs, and never ever underestimate the quiet people in the room. If there is one profound lesson to take away from this entire ordeal, it is that arrogance is the most dangerous vulnerability a person can possess. When people are blinded by their own greed and ego, they stop looking at the quiet corners of the room where the real power resides. They mistake kindness for weakness and silence for absolute ignorance. I learned that you do not need to raise your voice to protect the people you love. You just need to have the patience to let the wicked reveal their true nature and the absolute resolve to strike when they least expect it. True strength is remaining completely invisible until the exact moment you need to become undeniable. If you enjoyed hearing how I protected my family from these predators, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice.